The village of Thornhollow smelled of frost and smoke on the morning they came for Wren Ashford. She had known, somewhere deep in her chest, that this day would come. Ever since the harvest failed for the third year in a row, the elders had been whispering about the old rites, the ones her grandmother used to speak of only in a hushed voice, as though saying them too loudly might wake something in the mountains. The spirits are hungry, the old woman used to say. When the land stops giving, someone has to give it back. Wren had always thought those were just stories, the kind told to frighten children into obedience. She learned otherwise when the village priestess arrived at her door before sunrise, with 3 men behind her, their faces empty of any kindness. She did not scream. She did not fight. There was no use in fighting a whole village that had already decided her fate. Wren had lived 20 years in Thornhollow, without a family name, without a pack, without a single person who would miss her if she vanished. She was the girl who swept the tavern floors, who mended nets no one else wanted to touch, who slept in the loft above the miller's stable in exchange for chores. When the lottery stone was drawn from the ceremonial jar, and her name was called, no one in the crowd looked surprised. No one looked sorry, either. They led her through the frozen fields to the edge of the forest, where a flat gray stone waited beneath the bare branches of an ancient oak, the altar. Wren had passed it 100 times in her life, and never once thought it would be the last thing she saw. The priestess bound her wrists with rough cord and helped her kneel before the stone, murmuring words in a language Wren did not understand. The sky above was the color of a bruise, dark blue fading slowly into gray. Dawn was coming. The rite required blood before the sun cleared the mountains, or the spirits would take their anger out on the whole village instead. Wren stared at the horizon and tried to remember something happy. She thought of the way sunlight looked on the river in summer. She thought of a lullaby her grandmother used to hum, though she could no longer remember all the words. She thought that it was strange to be afraid and calm at the same time, the way she was now, kneeling in the cold with her heart hammering and her mind strangely still. The priestess raised the ceremonial dagger. Far away, in the capital city of Valemore, King Cale Draven woke from sleep, as if someone had driven a blade into his own chest. He sat upright, gasping, his hand pressed to his heart. Pain radiated through him, sharp and foreign, followed by something worse, fear. Not his own fear, someone else's. It poured into him like cold water, filling every part of his body until he could not tell where his mind ended and hers began. Cale had been Alpha King for 6 years. He had led his people through war, through famine, through betrayal from his own council. He was not a man who frightened easily, but this feeling clawed through him with a violence he had never known, and beneath it, faint as a heartbeat, he felt something else. A pull, a thread stretching from his chest toward the north, toward the mountains, toward a place he had never been. He knew what it was the moment he felt it, even though he had stopped believing it would ever happen to him. The mate bond. Dormant his whole life, silent through every arranged meeting and political courtship his advisors had pushed on him, and now, without warning, it had woken with the force of a scream. She was afraid, she was hurt, or about to be, and she was dying. Cale did not stop to explain himself to the guards at his door. He tore through the corridors of the palace, shedding his robe as he ran, and by the time he reached the courtyard he was already shifting, bones and muscle rearranging themselves in a blur of motion, until a massive gray wolf burst through the palace gates and into the dark countryside beyond. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life. The pull in his chest was a rope dragging him forward, and he followed it blindly, crossing frozen rivers and snow-covered hills, tearing through 3 territories in what felt like both an eternity and no time at all. His paws ate up the distance while his heart counted down a clock only he could hear. Every mile brought the fear in his chest closer to panic. Every mile brought the scent of her closer, faint at first, then stronger. Something warm and achingly familiar, though he had never smelled it before in his life. Blood, fear, cold stone, and underneath it all, her. He crested the last hill above Thornhollow, just as the sky began to lighten into gray dawn, and he saw them. A circle of villagers gathered at the edge of the forest. A woman kneeling before a flat stone altar. A priestess standing over her with a blade raised high, catching the first thin light of morning. Cale did not think, He simply moved. He crashed through the gathered crowd like a storm, scattering villagers who screamed and stumbled out of his path, and reached the altar in the same instant the dagger began its fall. He threw his massive body between the blade and the kneeling woman, and the edge that had been meant for her throat sliced instead across his shoulder, drawing a line of blood through gray fur. The priestess stumbled back with a cry. The crowd fell utterly silent. Chaol stood over the woman, his wolf body trembling, not from the wound, but from the storm of feeling crashing through him now that he was close enough to see her clearly. She was small and pale, her wrists bound with rope, her dark hair falling loose from its braid. She stared up at him with wide, startled eyes, more confused than afraid now, as if she could not understand why a wolf the size of a horse had just saved her life. He shifted back to human then, kneeling in the frost beside her, blood still trickling warm down his arm. Up close, the bond roared through him with such force that for a moment he could not speak. He had spent 6 years believing he would never feel this. Now it filled every corner of him at once, undeniable and absolute. "You're safe," he said, his voice rough. "I have you." The villagers around them had gone deathly still. Someone in the crowd whispered a word that spread through the gathering like fire through dry grass. Mate, the king's mate. They had bound her, dragged her to an altar, and nearly spilled her blood on a stone meant for sacrifice. And she was the mate of the Alpha King. The priestess dropped to her knees, the dagger falling from her hand. Around her, one by one, the villagers followed, faces pale with the sudden understanding of what they had almost done. Chaol felt fury rise in him like a living thing, a heat that made his vision sharpen at the edges. He could destroy this village with a word. He could make every person who had let this happen answer for it. But the woman beside him reached out and touched his arm with her bound wrists, and the small, fragile touch stopped him cold. "Please," she said quietly. Her voice shook, but there was something steady beneath the shaking, something that had survived 20 years of being unwanted and had not broken yet. "Don't burn it down. They're afraid. That's all this ever was. Fear." Chaol looked at her for a long moment. Here she was, moments from death at these people's hands, and her first thought was mercy for them rather than vengeance for herself. It undid something in him more thoroughly than the bond itself had. He untied her wrists with careful hands, his anger banked but not forgotten, and helped her to her feet. "What is your name?" he asked. "Ren," she said. "Ren Ashford." "Ren," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it, as though it were something precious. "You're coming with me." She did not argue. There was nothing left in Thornhollow for her to stay for, and something in his voice, low and certain, made her believe, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that someone actually wanted her to live. The journey back to the capital took 3 days by carriage, since Ren could not run the distance as Chaol had. He rode alongside the carriage most of the way, unwilling to let her out of his sight even for an hour, and when they stopped to rest, he sat near her fire rather than his own, watching her, with an intensity that made her cheeks warm even in the cold night air. She was quiet during the journey, still adjusting to the impossible shift her life had taken. 3 days ago she had been sweeping tavern floors. Now she was riding toward a palace to become, apparently, the mate of a king. She did not know how to hold both truths in her mind at once. "Why me?" she asked him on the second night, staring into the fire. "You could have anyone. Any noblewoman in your kingdom would give anything to be in my place." Chaol was quiet for a moment before answering. "The bond doesn't ask what would be convenient," he said. "It doesn't care about titles or land or bloodlines. It found you because you are the one meant for me. That isn't something either of us chose, but I intend to choose it anyway, every day, for as long as you'll let me." Ren did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, but something in her chest loosened slightly, a knot she had carried so long she had forgotten it was there. The palace was overwhelming when they arrived, silk instead of rags, warm halls instead of a drafty stable loft, servants who bowed to her, nobles who watched her with sharp, curious eyes, unsure what to make of a common village girl standing beside their king. Ren felt like an imposter in every room she entered, certain that at any moment, someone would realize the mistake and send her back to Thornhollow. But Chaol did not let that happen. He was patient, in a way she had not expected from a king, a man whose reputation in war was fierce and unyielding. With her, he was gentle. He did not rush her, did not press her for anything she was not ready to give. When nightmares of the altar and the blade woke her in the dark, he came to her without being summoned, sitting outside her door until she opened it, staying beside her bed until the shaking stopped and her breathing steadied. He never once made her feel foolish for the fear that still lingered. When a noblewoman at dinner made a cutting remark about Ren's lack of family name, Cale's voice cut through the hall colder than winter wind, and no one dared repeat the insult again. When Ren was too nervous to sit at the head table during council meetings, he moved his own chair beside hers instead of insisting she adjust to him. Slowly, without grand gestures or declarations, he taught her that she was allowed to take up space in this new life, that she belonged in it. Months passed. Winter faded into spring, and then circled back toward winter again, and somewhere in that turning of seasons, Ren stopped flinching when people looked at her, and started to believe, quietly and without fanfare, that she was safe, that this life was hers to keep. On the anniversary of the night she had knelt at the altar, Cale woke her before dawn and asked her to come with him. She dressed in the dark, curious but unafraid, and followed him out of the palace and into a carriage that carried them north, back toward Thornhollow, back toward the forest she had once thought she would die in. The clearing looked different now. The altar stone was gone, cleared away on Cale's order months before, the ground smoothed over, and planted with young trees that had not yet lost their leaves to the coming cold. Where the stone once stood, wildflowers grew instead, hardy things that had pushed up through the frost. Cale led her to the center of the clearing as the sky began to lighten, the same slow shift from deep blue to soft gray that had once meant her death. This time, it meant something else entirely. He knelt before her, not as a king, but simply as himself, and took her hands in his. "A year ago, this ground was going to take your life," he said. "I want it to give you something different now. I'm not asking as your king, I'm asking as the man the bond chose for you, and the one who chooses you back every single day since. Ren Ashford, will you bond with me? Will you let this place become the one where your life truly began, instead of the one where it nearly ended?" Ren looked at him, at the sincerity in his eyes, at the sunrise beginning to spill gold over the mountains behind him, and felt no fear at all, only a warmth that filled every corner of the emptiness she had carried for so long. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Yes." The sun cleared the mountains as he rose and pulled her close, and where a blade had once been meant to fall, there was only light, and the quiet certainty that the girl nobody had wanted was, at last, exactly where she was meant to be.